Fellas, this dude's been asking for a top 30 greatest MMA fighters of all time list for over 100 days now, so I feel like I've kind of got to do it. This is going to be my top 30 greatest MMA fighters of all time. I think Lucas Tracy also did some sort of GOAT list as well today, so I think it's the perfect time to do my top 30 greatest MMA fighters of all time. There's no excuses into this as well. I've looked at this, I've analysed this, I'm happy with the list, so if you disagree, there ain't no excuses. If it's a shit list, there ain't no excuses. This is my official list, and we'll go with there at number 30. In my opinion, the 30th greatest MMA fighter of all time is Ilia Toria. You might be saying recency bias. You might think it's too soon to include Toria in a GOAT list. I disagree. I think Toria's made it to the top 30 greatest MMA fighters of all time list. I mean, people are already making the comparison with Khabib and saying that if he beats Makhachev, he's going to be top 5 of all time. And if you're doing that already with Toria, you've got to include him in the top 30 of all time list. Now, the first main reason is he has the greatest back-to-back wins in UFC history. I don't think there's a fighter out there who has greater back-to-back wins than Toria has done in this last year. Like, if you'd have told me a few years ago when Alexander Volkanovski was dominating the featherweight division, clearing everyone out, battering everyone, and when Max Holloway was basically the second best forever, just behind Volkanovski destroyed everyone, that Ilia Toria was going to come in and beat them both. Not only just beat them both, but in dominant fashion, knocking out Alexander Volkanovski and then cracking the chin of Max Holloway in the same year. I would not have believed you, and I think what he's done this year alone has put him onto this list at number 30. Greatest back-to-back wins in UFC history, in my opinion, by knocking out both those guys. Which brings me up to my next point, which is he's the first to beat Volk at featherweight and the first to knock out Max in the UFC. Not only did he have some insane back-to-back wins, but they both meant something. Volkanovski had never been beaten in the featherweight division. He was destroying the featherweight division. When Volkanovski was in his prime, it didn't look like any other featherweight was going to come close to dethroning him. So for Toria to beat him, as well as Max Holloway, who most people would say had the #1 chin in the UFC and had never been finished in his MMA career by TKO as well, but Toria to go out there and beat them both in dominant fashion like that, knocking out Volkanovski, and beating Max Holloway in that fashion was impressive. He's undefeated and he's achieved all this in 16 months as well. For some reason, people love the idea of being undefeated, makes you onto a GOAT list, especially the Khabib fans. They think the fact that he's undefeated, he should be on the GOAT list. Well, Toria's undefeated and he hasn't had to pad his record as well. Ilia Toria, 16-0, undefeated, and what he's done already in his MMA career is insane. You compare that to Khabib, who in his first 16 fights, when he hadn't even debuted in the UFC yet, or Makhachev, whose best win was Gleison Tibau, or Israel Adesanya, who his best win was an old Anderson Silva by decision. And you look at what Toporia's done, knocking out Volkanovski and Holloway, the top 3 greatest heavyweights of all time. Not heavyweights, featherweights of all time. He's achieved a lot within just 16 fights as well. And he's argued as the most skilled fighter in the UFC right now. If we look at the pound for pound list in the UFC, John Jones, we all know why he's so high on this list. Dana White, we all know why it is. So we're eliminating Jones. Alex Pereira, I think he deserves to be top 2 pound for pound, but he ain't got the grappling, so he ain't the most skilled. It's between Makhachev and Toria. The only way we're going to settle this is if they fight each other, which is probably going to be inevitably happening in the next few years. So he's arguably the most skilled fighter in the UFC right now, as well as Islam Makhachev. So I think Ilia Toria, even though you can say a recency bias and say it's way too soon to include him on the list, people are already comparing him with Khabib. People are saying that if he beats Makhachev, he's going to be the greatest of all time. If that's the case, he's got to be in the top 30. You can't jump from being outside top 30 straight to top 5 over one win. So I'm going to include Ilia Toria at number 30. I think what he's done in the UFC so far in this last year is so impressive. On top of that, he's beaten Bryce Mitchell, took the O away from Bryce Mitchell, butchered Josh Emmett, and he is looking like he's unstoppable. Again, I'm not going to base this too much off potential because you can't really include potential in a GOAT list, but I'm going to put Toria at 30. I think he's earned that 30 spot. At 29, I'm going Leon Edwards. I think Leon Edwards gets disrespected too much these days as well. People kind of just see him as this boring guy with no personality who got dominated by Belal Muhammad, and you're not wrong, but you've got to at least recognize his legacy as well. Now, the first main reason I think Leon Edwards deserves to be on this list is because he beat pound for pound #1 Usman, as I just skipped by. Usman was pound for pound #1 at one time in the UFC, dominating everyone. And when I say dominating, I mean he was breaking the likes of Kobe Covington's jaw, knocking out Gilbert Burns when Gilbert Burns was ranked #1. He basically looked like no welterweight was ever going to beat Kamaru Usman. I mean, he was close to literally overtaking Anderson Silva's record. So for Leon Edwards to knock him out, sending him to another dimension, and then beat him by decision immediately after this proved that it wasn't just a fluke, you've got to give Leon credit for that. Beating pound for pound #1 Usman when no other welterweight even came remotely close, apart from maybe Kobe in the rematch. You've got to give Leon his credit. He beat him by decision and he put him to sleep. So I'm going to include, I think that's the first main reason for Leon Edwards being on this list. The next reason is again kind of tying to Kamaru Usman, and it's that he's the first guy to beat, knock out, and take down Usman in the UFC. Usman, I mean, he was undefeated in the UFC prior to that fight with Leon Edwards. He had lost in MMA before, but in the UFC, he was on this big winning streak. Like I said, almost overtook Anderson Silva's winning streak, and he was dominating everyone. So for Leon to be the first guy to beat him, get the decision win over, well, not get the decision win and knock him out at the same time. First guy to knock him out, put his lights out in his entire MMA career, not just the UFC, but his entire MMA career. And the first guy to take him down. I know there's an argument to say that Colby Covington took him down, but technically on paper, Leon was the first guy to take Usman down. To do all that and break all those records against Usman in one fight, you've got to give Leon his credit again. And I understand it's kind of just tying into Usman too much is this. It's not really his own legacy. But the next point is that he only lost 3 times in the UFC, did Leon Edwards. I mean, he lost to Kamaru Usman, who he's 2-1 against, and he got the better out of. He lost to Bilal Muhammad, who's the current welterweight champion on a big streak. And he lost in his UFC debut, or one of his first UFC fights, in a very close split decision. And those were his only fights that he's lost in the UFC to this day. And I think he's a top 4 welterweight of all time, with the likes of Matt Hughes, GSP, and obviously Kamaru Usman. I think Leon's up there. I think he's above Woodley, at least. People saying that Woodley's above Leon Edwards, that's the most blatant. He's not even nostalgia bias, because Woodley's not even nostalgia. He was only around in like 2020, so I think Leon's better than Woodley. I think he's a top 4 welterweight of all time. I'm not saying he's above Usman or anything like that, but I think all the reasons combined, you've got to include Leon on the GOAT list, and I'm going to put him at number 29. I think people kind of overlook his legacy and kind of just see him as this guy getting this fluky win over Usman and then going and getting dominated by Bilal Muhammad. But I think when you really look at Leon Edwards' career as a perspective, he's actually had quite a successful career in the UFC and one of the greatest knockouts of all time. At number 28, I'm going to go with Frankie Edgar. One of the greatest lightweights of all time undoubtedly was Frankie Edgar. You've got to include him in a GOAT list. The first reason why is I think he was a top 4 lightweight of all time. Frankie Edgar in his prime was something else. This dude was facing the top competition at the time and just making it look easy. And even if he was losing, he was making it super competitive. And he's in the most competitive division in the UFC, the lightweight division, which gives him bonus points, the fact that he's a top 5 of all time. With the likes of Khabib and Makhachev and BJ Penn, I think you've got to include Frankie Edgar within that list too. I'm not saying he's necessarily number 1, because I know there's people that have, you know, come into the lightweight division, had better legacies, but you still can't deny the legacy of Frankie Edgar, one of the greatest lightweights of all time. The next reason is he's a former champion as well. I mean, I know it's not really setting the bar high saying that he's a former champion, but it wasn't just a former champion on one occasion. He was a former champion on multiple different occasions. To do that in the lightweight division, the most competitive division in the UFC, against some of the other GOATs like BJ Penn, is super impressive for Frankie Edgar. The next reason is he fought so many killers and either beat them or made it competitive to Frankie Edgar. He's fought so many monsters in his career. I mean, just look at his record. Even the fact that he was losing Jose Aldo by decision, Benson Henderson by split decision and unanimous decision, Gray Maynard as well by split decision. And apart from that, he was just dominating some of the best at the time. He fought in one of the most competitive eras of the lightweight division, and he was basically the title fight, nearly in a title fight, nearly every single one of his fights. And if he wasn't the title fight, it was the number 1 contender fight as well. And he has wins over so many elite fighters. Kind of just ties into my past point, but he had so many elite wins, beat some of the lightweight GOATs in the guys like BJ Penn. So Frankie Edgar, I'm going to give him that number 28 spot. I feel like you've got to include him in the GOAT list. He had a really good legacy in the lightweight division, and I think you've just got to include him. And then at number 27, I'm going to go with Dustin the Diamond Poirier. And even though Dustin Poirier never actually won an undisputed belt, which a lot of people might kind of require for a GOAT list, that brings me into my first point, which is he's the greatest fighter to never win a belt. I think that Dustin Poirier is the greatest fighter in UFC history to never touch undisputed gold. I mean, we look at, you know, some other guys like Alexander Gustafsson, Dan Henderson, Yoel Romero. These are some other guys that have had great careers without winning undisputed gold. But I feel like Dustin Poirier, in my opinion, has done enough to kind of earn the right to call himself the greatest fighter to never win a belt. What he's achieved and the people we've beaten, and we'll get onto that right now. I think he's got the greatest resume, or one of the greatest resumes of all time. Max Holloway twice. We know how good Max Holloway is. He's also one of the greatest of all time. Poirier beat him twice. Beat Conor McGregor twice as well. I know McGregor's beaten him before, but he had a win over him. Justin Gaethje, he's managed to get a win over Justin Gaethje. He finished him. Finished Michael Chandler. Finished Benoit Saint Denis. Had a war with Dan Hooker, Eddie Alvarez, Anthony Pettis, Jim Miller, Bobby Green, Diego Ferreira. His resume in the lightweight division might actually be the greatest resume in the lightweight division, and one of the greatest resumes in UFC history. And again, that's why I say he's the greatest fighter to never win a belt, because he's beaten so many former champions, so many monsters. And just because he's never won a belt, you can't really discredit his legacy. And he only loses to the elite competition. I mean, look at the guys he's losing to. Prime Conor McGregor when McGregor was on his come-up. Islam Makhachev, pound for pound #1. Charles Oliveira when Oliveira was on his run. Knocked out by Justin Gaethje and lost to Khabib, who some people would say is in the top 10, top 15 greatest of all time. It ain't like he's losing to cans. If he lost to Benoit Saint Denis, fair enough. These are where we start questioning his losses. But he's losing to guys who are elite competition. And apart from that, he's smoking everyone. So I think Dustin Poirier, the greatest fighter to never win a belt in UFC history. You've got to include him in the top 30 30 list, and I'm going to put him at number 27, 30-9, great record, great resume, and like I said, greatest fighter to never win a belt. At number 26, I'm going to go with Francis Ngannou. You might be looking at this and saying Ngannou should not be in a GOAT list, but I disagree. I beg to differ. I think Francis Ngannou is a perfect representation of the heavyweight division, and I'm going to put him at 26 in my list. Now, the first reason is he's a former UFC champion. He defended it and he never lost it. Again, we're not really setting the bar too high by saying former UFC champion at GOAT list, but I mean, to do this in the heavyweight division, a lot of the time in the heavyweight division, especially back from like the 2015 to, well, 2010 to 2020 era, people would win a belt and immediately lose it, and Ngannou didn't do that. He won the belt by beating Stipe in dominant fashion, the greatest heavyweight of all time, and he beat Stipe by knockout. Then he defended it against Ciryl Gane when Gane was on the come, and I'm pretty sure Gane was a favourite going into that fight, and he never lost it either. He went to PFL, and technically to this day, he's still the lineal heavyweight champion of the world, which is quite impressive in itself. The next reason is he's beaten 5 former champions. I think having 5 former champions, I mean, especially John Jones. John Jones loves to criticize Aspinall for not beating any legends. Well, what's the excuse for Ngannou? Because he's beaten so many legends. Andre Arlovski, Junior Dos Santos, Ciryl Gane, if you count the interim belt, Stipe Miocic, Cain Velasquez. These are some of the greatest heavyweights of all time. I mean, beating Stipe literally is beating the greatest heavyweight of all time. And I get it, they weren't in their prime, they were past their prime, but even just having those names on your resume, you've got to give Ngannou credit for. The next reason is that he finished Stipe for the belt and he took the L from Ciryl Gane. I think his title wins were more impressive than people make it out to be. He finished the greatest heavyweight of all time. Maybe he wasn't in his prime, but he finished the greatest heavyweight of all time in dominant fashion, brutally knocking him out. We've never seen Stipe like that before. I know DC knocked him out, but it was nowhere near as brutal. And to Ciryl Gane, the undefeated Ciryl Gane, who I'm pretty sure was a favourite going into that fight, and Ngannou basically comfortably won by just basically dominating him. I don't want to say dominated the fight, but when it came to the grappling exchanges, picking him up and slamming him and just basically dominating him with the grappling as well. So I think his title wins are more impressive than people make it out to be. And the next reason, I think he's the most dangerous heavyweight of all time, and he's still active today. I've said this before. I think Ngannou is the perfect representation of the heavyweight division because he's just pure power and knockout ability, and he's still active to this day. Renan Fajeda, who proved himself to be the best fighter outside the UFC right now, and he goes out there and destroys Renan Fajeda in 1 round, takes him down and bullies him with ground and pound. I think he's the most dangerous heavyweight of all time. I think if you put Ngannou against any heavyweight in the history of mixed martial arts, you cannot be 100% sure that whoever he's facing wins. So I think I'm going to put Ngannou at number 26 on this list. Maybe he doesn't have this long list of title defenses in the UFC and he didn't have the longest title reign, but I feel like for what he's done in the heavyweight division, the amount of people he's knocked out, the amount of finishes he's got, and just the overall way he represents heavyweight, I'm going to put him at number 26. And then at number 25, I'm going to go with Cain Velasquez, another heavyweight who I think had a great resume, great legacy as well. Now, the first reason for Cain Velasquez is that he was a 2-time heavyweight champion. It wasn't just a 1-time heavyweight champion, won it on 2 different occasions as well. You've got to give Cain Velasquez credit. Showed that he was at the top on multiple different occasions. So I think Cain Velasquez being a 2-time heavyweight champion, you've got to include that as well. The next reason is he has wins over Lesnar, Junior Dos Santos, and Big Nog. And these were, he didn't just beat washed Lesnar or washed Junior Dos Santos or anything like that. He beat Lesnar when Lesnar was on a 4-fight winning streak, 3 of them coming by way of finish, and had won 3 title fights in a row. That was the Lesnar that he beat. He beat Junior Dos Santos on 2 different occasions, and Junior Dos Santos was an absolute monster back in the day as well, beating Big Nog in the fashion that he did. I think Cain Velasquez, he's just an absolute mauler, and that brings me on to my next point, which is one of the best heavyweights ever in his prime. And he used to absolutely maul the best heavyweights on the planet. He kind of reminds me, if I had to compare him to a fighter nowadays, it would be Anthony Hernandez if he had a better striking. That's how dangerous Cain Velasquez was. He would just maul people. He would just bully people on the feet, extremely dangerous hands, and he's wrestling as well. He had some of the highest level wrestling at the time in the heavyweight division. He would take people down and just absolutely batter them with ground and pound. If not, he'd submit with, threaten submissions. And what I like about Cain Velasquez, he's kind of like a thresh of a breath of fresh air. When it came to grapplers, because I know a lot of grapplers back in the day, they used to kind of be, point grapplers. They take people down, try and rack up control time. Cain Velasquez, he wasn't about that. He was all about damage. If he was taking you down, he was taking you down with intent. He wanted to bully with ground and pound or get the submission, and he had intent in doing everything harmful when he took people down. So I'm going to put Cain Velasquez at number 25. Top 5 greatest heavyweights of all time, in my opinion. At number 24, I'm going to go with TJ Dillashaw. I understand he popped for steroids. He might have had some controversy in his career, but I think TJ Dillashaw deserves some respect. The first reason is he had 3 total defenses in his UFC career and a 2-time champion. And even though that might not seem like a long list, this was in the bantamweight division, you've got to remember, and there is yet to be a bantamweight with this long list of title defenses because of how competitive the division is. So for TJ Dillashaw to go out there and defend it not once, not twice, but 3 different times and be a 2-time champion as well, I think is very impressive of TJ Dillashaw. And again, when I give TJ Dillashaw compliments, I understand that he did take steroids, which kind of deducts points a bit, which is why I guess he can be kind of low on this list. But 3 total defenses in the bantamweight division and a 2-time champion. He was at the top for a long time, and I feel like that's what you've got to credit TJ Dillashaw for. The next reason is I think he's the 2nd greatest bantamweight of all time. I would say Dominick Cruz is number 1, and we'll talk about him later on in this video, but I would say just behind Dominick Cruz is TJ Dillashaw. And there's people out there, because of the fact that he was a 2-time champion and how dangerous he was, that would put TJ Dillashaw above Dominick Cruz. So I think TJ Dillashaw having that over Dominick Cruz, just be behind Dominick Cruz, you've got to give him that. And the next reason, as he's only lost to Cruz in his prime, when TJ Dillashaw was in his prime, he only lost to Dominick Cruz. He'd won 4, and he'd won 4 before the Cruz fight and won 4 after the Cruz fight. This was when it was prime TJ Dillashaw. And when he did lose to Dominick Cruz, it was a split decision to the greatest bantamweight of all time. That just shows you how dangerous TJ Dillashaw was in his prime and how effective he was in the bantamweight division. So I think in his prime, he was one of the most dangerous bantamweights of all time. Going to a very close decision with Dominick Cruz, he's being your only loss in your prime. I think we can't really, take away too much for Dominick Cruz. And he had amazing wins over Prime Garbrandt and Barao as well. I mean, we know how dangerous Cody Garbrandt was. For TJ Dillashaw to finish him twice, I know he was quite chinny, but at the time, what we'd seen from Cody Garbrandt is him styling on Dominick Cruz, and then we immediately saw TJ Dillashaw go there and dominate. And the other impressive wins he had in the bantamweight division, where he was just absolutely outboxing people. He had the quickest hands. He was one of the most powerful dudes in the division. His hands was just terrifying as well. So Dominick Cruz, I think what he'd done in the bantamweight division, I think is the 2nd greatest bantamweight of all time. Did take steroids, which is why I can't really put him any higher, but I'm going to put him at number 24 on this list. At number 23, I'm going to go with Charles Oliveira at number 23 on this list. Yeah, I think Charles Oliveira deserves to be behind the GOAT list as well. I'm not saying he's the greatest lightweight of all time or anything like that, but I feel like Charles Oliveira, he just had a super impressive career. I mean, the first reason, 11-fight winning streak in the lightweight division. We've already been over the fact that lightweight is one of the most competitive divisions in the UFC. Charles Oliveira being on a massive winning streak, and every single one of them was by finish as well, apart from the fight with Tony Ferguson. That was just Tony refusing to tap to an armbar. Apart from that, an 11-fight winning streak in the most competitive division in the UFC, and nearly every single one of them, I mean, only one of them survived in Tony Ferguson. He's super impressive for Charles Oliveira. He went on one of the best runs we've ever seen in the lightweight division. Absolute beast. The next reason, 3 lightweight title wins. Again, we're going about how the lightweight division is a super competitive division. I mean, we talk about the greatest lightweights of all time in modern era anyway. Khabib couldn't defend more than 3 times. Makhachev's only had a handful of defenses. So Oliveira having 3 lightweight title wins against Michael Chandler, against Dustin Poirier, and against Justin Gaethje. I know that Justin Gaethje one technically wasn't for the belt because he missed weight. But if you're telling me you're not going to count that as a title win just because he weighed in half a pound over, and you're going to be a little statistic nerd, just get out, man. I think give him the 3rd title win as well. 3 lightweight title wins against some absolute monsters in guys like Chandler, Poirier, and Gaethje. The next reason, most finishes in UFC history. I mean, what a stat to have, having the most finishes in UFC history with 20. And it looks like nobody's going to be overtaking that as well. I'm pretty sure the 2nd place is Jim Miller at number 18, and Jim Miller's probably about a fight or 2 away from retirement. So it looks like with the way things are going, Charles Oliveira being one of the most dangerous dudes in the UFC, it looks like no one's going to overtake that record, and he is one of the most dangerous fighters in the UFC, so he's got the most finishes in the UFC. And the next reason, arguably the best Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu in modern UFC history. I know I'm not going to go all the way back to the Gracie days of the UFC, but he arguably has the best Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and is one of the best representatives for Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. He's an absolute master on the ground, to the point where people would drop him and they wouldn't want to follow down with ground and pound shots. They just want to let him get back up because of how scary his Jiu-Jitsu was. The only person that dared to even compete with him in the grappling department was Islam Makhachev, and obviously we all saw how that turned out. But Oliveira, amazing jiu-jitsu. I think he's got the more submissions wins as well in the UFC as well as finishes, so he is one of the best Brazilian jiu-jitsu artists in modern UFC history anyway. So I feel like Charles Oliveira, he had a really good run in the lightweight division, and he's still number 2 to this day. I mean, he came off a win over Beneil Dariush not long ago, and even in his last fight, a close fight with Omar Sarukian, who's going to be fighting for a belt next, and you never know. Listen, I'm not going to say that Oliveira wins a belt again because I don't think he does, but he could do it. You couldn't count him out. It's Oliveira. If there's one guy you don't want to count out, It is Charles Oliveira. So I'm going to put him at number 23. Number 22, I'm going to go with Conor McGregor. Now, there's going to be people that would argue he should be higher on this list. There's going to be people that argue he should be lower on this list. I feel like you've got to include McGregor somewhere on a GOAT list. And I understand he didn't have a single title defense, but I'll go over the main reasons. The first reason, I mean, he's the first fighter to hold 2 belts simultaneously. He wasn't obviously the first guy to win a belt in 2 weight classes, but the first guy to hold 2 belts simultaneously was a big deal. I mean, to go out there and beat Eddie Alvarez and Jose Aldo for 2 different belts, super impressive from Conor McGregor. Holding 2 belts simultaneously. The first guy to do that, obviously wasn't the last, but the fact that he was the first guy to do that, and he was insane to see at the UFC at the time. I mean, nowadays we talk about potentially seeing a triple champion, somebody having a belt simultaneously in 3 different weight classes. That was what it kind of felt like when McGregor won a belt at 2 different weight classes simultaneously. So he's definitely got the accomplishment. And the second accomplishment, I mean, knocking out Prime Aldo in 13 seconds. Aldo was unbeatable at featherweight. He was battering everyone. The best competitors in featherweight at the time, Aldo was beating those guys. So for Conor McGregor to come in and knock him out in 13 seconds, I don't think you understand how big of a win that was. That would be the equivalent of if Alexander Volkanovski never lost or never fought Makhachev and just kept defending in the featherweight division, and then Ilia Toria comes out and knocks him out, not in 2 rounds, but in 13 seconds. What McGregor did to Prime Aldo in 13 seconds, the fact that nobody could beat Aldo and McGregor did it in under 15 was so impressive. The next reason, this is more of an accomplishment, this is more of just what he's done for the sport of MMA, but it is that he is the most impactful and influential athlete in MMA history. There hasn't been anyone as impactful for the sport of MMA than Conor McGregor. I guarantee there's some people watching this that are only watching this because of what Conor McGregor did. You can say he's a shit fighter, you can say that he's out of his mind, but without a doubt, he's the biggest star, and he is created the most impact for the UFC, man. What state would the UFC be nowadays if it wasn't for Conor McGregor? Again, this is more of a pioneer point of view rather than an actual accomplishment thing, but I'm just going to include that in why you've got to put him somewhere in the list of greatest of all time. So I think Conor McGregor, there are all going to be people out there, especially the Dagestani fans, that make fun of him. He never had a title defense, and he had a lot of, you know, gifted matchups, but knocking out Aldo in 13 seconds, becoming the first guy to hold 2 belts simultaneously. He is the biggest star. He's won a belt, not won a belt, but won a fight in 3 different weight classes as well. You've got to give Conor McGregor the credit. I'm putting him at 22. Might be too high, but I don't care. And number 21, I'm going to go with Chuck Liddell, one of the OGs of the UFC. I mean, we talk about Conor McGregor being a pioneer for the UFC. I mean, talk about Chuck Liddell. Where would the UFC be, or where would it have taken off if Chuck Liddell weren't? Because he was a big star back in the day as well. The first reason, 4 title defenses, and 4 title defenses back then was a big deal as well. For Chuck Liddell to go out there and defend it on 4 different occasions, majority coming by way of finish. I mean, he was an absolute beast back in the day, and again, I talk about back in the day, it was much harder to defend the belt because people could barely hold on to belts. And the next reason is he dominated light heavyweight, beating some of the best at the time. And obviously, I'm not comparing it to the current state of the light heavyweight division, but when Chuck Liddell was active, he was beating some of the best light heavyweights at the time, and he was just dominating everyone. I mean, look at the winning streak he went on throughout his UFC career. Beating the likes of Randy Couture, beating the likes of Alistair Overeem, beating the likes of Vitor Belfort, Tito Ortiz. These were the guys that Chuck Liddell was beating, and he was doing it in dominant fashion as well. I mean, the last couple of wins on his run, he was knocking everybody out within a couple of rounds. It was an absolute knockout machine, dominated the division of light heavyweight. Some people still include him in the greatest light heavyweight list of all time, because of what he did in his prime. The next reason is he has some amazing wins. Randy Couture twice, Tito Ortiz, Vanderlei Silva, Vitor Belfort, Kevin Randleman, Alistair Overeem. These are some of the wins that Chuck Liddell had back in the day, and the majority of them were by finish. He's a pioneer for the light heavyweight division. He was an absolute beast in his prime. I mean, he was just beating some of the best competition at the time. So I'm going to put Chuck Liddell at number 21. At number 20, I'm going to go with Matt Hughes. Now, I couldn't actually find a proper PNG image of Matt Hughes, which is why it's only his upper body in this one. But no, Matt Hughes, first reason, 7 title defenses. I mean, that's super impressive to have in the welterweight division. 7 title defenses in the welterweight division. It's super impressive for Matt Hughes, considering that most champions, even nowadays, can't get past like 3 or 2 title defenses. Matt Hughes just casually got 7. You've got to give Matt Hughes the credit for that. And he was doing it against, you know, high-quality opponents as well. He wasn't doing it against bums. He was doing it against some pretty solid opponents, like Carlos Newton, who was a champion as well at the time. Anyway, the next reason, finished GSP. That alone should give you credit. If we're going to give Leon credit for finishing Usman, you've got to give Matt Hughes credit for finishing GSP. Some people have GSP as the greatest fighter of all time. For Matt Hughes to go out there and finish GSP, make him tap, not only beat him, but finish him as well, you've got to give Matt Hughes the credit for that, beating arguably the greatest fighter of all time, or at least one of the greatest fighters of all time. The next reason, batted nearly every welterweight during his prime. When Matt Hughes was in his prime, He was battering everyone in the welterweight division, making it look easy. So I'm going to put Matt Hughes at 20. I think he's top 3 greatest welterweights of all time. I think he goes GSP Usman, then Matt Hughes. I mean, you could even argue that Matt Hughes could be above Usman. I mean, if you even just look at his record, 45-9. I know a lot of his wins were, you know, back when they weren't the best competition, but 45-9, 7 title defenses, finished GSP, didn't just beat him, but finished GSP. I think we've got to give Matt Hughes the credit. I know I've said you got to give people credit about 50 times already this video, but I'm going to put Matt Hughes in the top 20. And number 19, Randy Couture. Similar spot to Chuck Liddell. He was a bit of a pioneer in MMA. But no, Randy Couture's an absolute legend as well. The first reason why is he was the first man to win a belt in 2 weight classes. Fair enough, Conor McGregor might have been the first man to win a belt simultaneously, but Randy Couture, he was the first man to win the belt in 2 different weight classes. Nobody in the UFC at the time had won a belt in 2 different weight classes. Randy Couture was the first guy to do that, so he still holds the record for being the first guy to hold the belt in 2 weight classes. The next reason, 8 title wins across 2 different weight classes. He just kept bouncing up from light heavyweight and heavyweight and just title fight after title fight. I understand he couldn't hold on his belt for too long. When he'd win a couple of title fights, he'd end up losing it, but nearly every single one of his fights from 1997 all the way to like 2007 was a title fight. It was very rare you wouldn't see Randy Couture in a title fight, and the reason he was in title fights so often is because he was having success. He was beating the champions, beating the likes of Vitor Belfort and Tito Ortiz, and we'll get onto that in a second because he's a multiple-time champion, as I just went over. You know, multiple times he'd win a belt, lose a belt, win a belt, lose a belt. I mean, I can't even count how many times Randy Couture's been a champion now because of how many times he's won the belt, but the final reason, which I think is the most important, is because he's beaten, I've not even put the reason on screen, what a knobhead, but no, just the resume that he had. Vitor Belfort, Tito Ortiz, you know, Chuck Liddell, these guys that Randy Couture was beating and facing at the time. Some people who nowadays people would include in the GOAT list. These are the guys that Randy Couture was beating, and you could just never count him out. So I'm going to put Randy Couture at number 19. At number 18, I'm going to go with BJ Penn. I feel like BJ Penn is one of the most overlooked lightweights of all time. People just look at the record 16-14 and see that he went on this big losing streak and had a terrible end to his career. I mean, he even got knocked out on the streets, and they kind of just disrespect the legacy of BJ Penn. But you had to just look at him. Just look at his highlights. Look at him in his prime. This dude was an absolute monster in his prime, which is my first point. BJ Penn, in his prime, was an absolute monster. He was, I mean, he could grapple. He was like the elite grappler. He was the elite boxer. He had like every martial art ticked off to the highest level in his prime. He was just battering everyone he went up against. Nearly every single guy that BJ Penn faced, he would absolutely batter. He was an absolute beast in his prime. And you've got to go and watch him to just see how good he was. He was so far ahead of the competition when he was around in the UFC. It's unbelievable. The next point, a champion in 2 different weight classes, obviously being a lightweight champion, a welterweight champion. And it wasn't just the fact that he had 2 different belts, obviously not simultaneously, but he was a champion in different weight classes. But it was also the fact that this dude, he fought in so many different divisions. I'm pretty sure at one point he fought a light heavyweight. He was getting wins in like 4 or 5 different weight classes in the time. Weight wasn't an issue for BJ Penn. If he wanted to fight, he'd fight, and he doesn't give a fuck about the weight. He'd go up, he'd go down, then he'd just fight people because that's what he liked doing. The next point, he's one of the most well-rounded fighters during his era. I remember people saying things about BJ Penn as if he had boxing like Pacquiao and grappling like the Gracies, because he was just so well-rounded. He had such high-level jiu-jitsu, such high-level wrestling, such dangerous hands. His fight IQ was amazing as well. Just overall how good BJ Penn was. I get it, he went on this big losing streak towards the end of his career, but in his prime, when he was at the top of his game, he seemed nearly unstoppable. And he had some good wins as well, and he had competitive fights with the best at the time in his early career. You look at the guys that he was fighting the likes of GSP. I'm pretty sure GSP said that BJ Penn was one of his hardest fights, and he took GSP to a split decision as well, beating the likes of Matt Hughes as well, who we already went over as one of the greatest welterweights of all time. The fact that he was able to accomplish this across multiple weight classes, I'm going to say that BJ Penn gets number 18th. Top 3 greatest lightweights of all time, in my opinion. Top 2 become between Makhachev and Khabib, but top 3 definitely got to include BJ Penn just because of how good he was in his prime. And it wasn't just the lightweight division, but it was also what he did in other divisions. So I'm going to put BJ Penn at number 18. At number 17, I'm going to go with Dominick Cruz. In my opinion, he is the greatest bantamweight of all time, which is my first point. He's the greatest bantamweight of all time. I mean, bantamweight is seen as one of the most competitive divisions in the UFC, and nowadays people can't even hold on to a belt. But Dominick Cruz in his prime was just, I mean, it was something else. I mean, to be the greatest of all time in this division anyway, just shows you how, you know, how accomplished Dominick Cruz was. I think he is the greatest bantamweight of all time. Some people, like I said earlier on in the video, argue that it's TJ Dillashaw. I think it's Dominick Cruz just for how good he was and the accomplishments that we are going to go over. 3 title defenses might not seem that much, but how many bantamweights nowadays can even get past 3 defenses? People saying that Aljamain Sterling was going to overtake Dominick Cruz, and obviously, I mean, he had a fraudulent title run anyway, and even his defenses weren't even impressive. Dominick Cruz getting 3 different defenses over, I mean, TJ Dillashaw, when Dillashaw was in his prime as well and juiced up, over Uriah Faber as well, coming from WEC, but he still beat Faber in some of his defenses as well. And that's not even to count WEC as well. And that's not even to count the run that Dominick Cruz went on in WEC. So I'm going to say, yeah, 3 title defenses as well. The next reason, 2-time bantamweight champion and never even lost the first time. Dominick Cruz went on a big win, and you could argue that he would have had more than just 3 defenses. I mean, obviously, I'm going to include WEC as well. And he lost a belt, but that wasn't due to losing it to a fighter. He's a 2-time champion because he got injured, came back a couple of years later, and then went back to dominating the bantamweight division. That was just what Cruz was doing. 2-time champion, never lost a belt. And some would say he has some of the greatest fight IQ of all time. And I agree. Dominick Cruz's fight IQ, it might not sound like in a commentary, especially when you go through the McGregor versus Khabib commentary, but in his prime, not even just in his prime, but in general, Dominick Cruz has displayed some of the greatest fight IQ we've seen, which is why he's had so much success in the bantamweight division, knew when to do the perfect thing at the perfect time. And he's still ranked to this day as well. I mean, even to this day, just shows the longevity of Dominick Cruz. The fact that he's still ranked number 15th in the bantamweight division just shows you where he's at nowadays. So I'm going to say that Dominick Cruz, 17, greatest bantamweight of all time. Some people might say this is low, but I feel like there's a guy we've got to put above Dominick Cruz, and that is Henry Cejudo. The king of cringe. I'm going to put Henry Cejudo at number 16 to my greatest of all time list. The first reason, double champion, flyweight and bantamweight. I mean, we all know that winning a belt in multiple different weight classes is very impressive. And Henry Cejudo, able to do it simultaneously. There's been very few fighters that have been able to win a belt in 2 weight classes simultaneously. Henry Cejudo being one of them, winning the flyweight champion and the bantamweight champion. Super impressive for Henry Cejudo. Definitely by far his biggest accomplishment. The next reason, he beat Cruz, Johnson, and Dillashaw within 2 years. Imagine your resume in 2 years from 2018 to 2020 being Dominick Cruz by finish, the greatest bantamweight of all time. TJ Dillashaw, Demetrius Johnson. That's what he achieved, and he defended 2 belts at the same time. When he was double champ, he didn't just defend the belt, move up a weight class, and forget about the other belt. He defended 2 different belts simultaneously. He practically had the flyweight and the bantamweight division in a chokehold from 2018 and 2020. He owned both of those divisions simultaneously, and that's why out of a lot of these guys who have won simultaneous belts, Henry Cejudo was one of them that impresses me the most. So I'm going to say that Henry Cejudo gets number 16th. He retired too early, man. I mean, it just begs the question, what could have Henry Cejudo achieved had he not retired too early and come back a few years later to fight still? And if he'd have just kept on going, because he was beating the likes of Dillashaw, Cruz, and Demetrius Johnson in his prime as well. So if he'd have kept on going, he could have been even higher on this list. But even though what he's achieved so far, I think what I give him credit, 16-4, and he's going to get that 16 spot in this list. And number 15, I'm going to go with Israel Adesanya. People who don't include Adesanya in the top 15 GOAT list, or even the top 20 GOAT list, I just think, why? Like, if he had a different personality, if Adesanya had the personality of someone else, you'd be include him in the list. I get it, he's got a bit of an off-putting personality, but you've got to include him in the list, in my opinion. The first reason why, he is the greatest middleweight of all time, just behind Anderson Silva. I think Adesanya is the greatest middleweight of all time. I mean, the amount of defenses he had, the fact that he cleared out the division, which we are going to go into in more detail in a second, but I would say he is the second greatest middleweight, just behind Anderson Silva. The next reason, 5 title defenses, which is quite respectable. I mean, if we look at nowadays, most champions can't even get past 1 or 2 defenses. Adesanya got 5. It might have not been against the highest competition, but he still did it. I mean, Robert Whittaker beat him twice. I know one of them was controversial. Jared Cannonier, Marvin Vettori twice. One of them wasn't for the belt, but he still beat him twice. Paulo Costa finished him. Yoel Romero, Kelvin Gastelum, the absolute war that he had. And you can complain that the middleweight division wasn't the most competitive, and he was in a very bad spot of the middleweight division, but you can't blame Adesanya. He was beating what he got given. And he was beating, he was just beating the best that he got given. So 5 title defenses was impressive. The next reason, cleared out the middleweight division from 2018 to 2022. When Adesanya, from 2018 to 2022, this is why Adesanya had so much hype and why he was one of the biggest stars, because he cleared out the middleweight division, beating the best. He made it look, he didn't even make, well, he did make it look kind of close in some fights, but he cleared out the division. I mean, he started lapping again, having to rematch the likes of Vettori, having to rematch the likes of Robert Whittaker, because he'd already cleared out the division and weren't anyone named for him to fight. He had to go up and face Jan Blachowicz after only a few defenses in the middleweight division. And the last reason is the only guy to beat Porton in the UFC. Porton's on a streak right now, and the only smudge in his resume is Israel Adesanya himself. I think beating Porton has aged really well for Israel Adesanya. So I think Israel Adesanya, number 15th, I get it. He might have not been facing the best middleweights if you look at it in hindsight. He didn't beat the middleweights nowadays. He ended up losing to Porton. He ended up losing to Strickland. He ended up losing to Dricus du Plessis. But Adesanya, the middleweight champion that he was, the people who was beating, the run that he went, and you've got to give him credit. 24-4. I'm going to put him at number 15 for, well, he's Adesanya. I'm going to put him at number 15 greatest of all time. At number 14, I'm going to go with Kamaru Usman. I think Kamaru Usman is the number 14th greatest of all time. Now, the reasons why he is the greatest welterweight behind GSP. Yeah, Usman, I mean, prime Usman was something. I remember when there was a time when people were saying that he had potential to overtake GSP and potentially become the greatest of all time. I mean, even Dana White nowadays refers to Usman as the greatest welterweight of all time for some reason. Probably because he's trying to forget GSP, because for some reason, whenever someone leaves the UFC, Dana loves just forgetting about the legacy. But Usman, in my opinion, he's the greatest welterweight just behind GSP, which is a massive accomplishment. To be the best of a very competitive division is super impressive. The next reason, 5 title defenses. That's pretty impressive as well. I mean, I've already gone over how having defenses nowadays means a lot because no one can hold onto a belt. 5 title defenses from 2019 to 2021. Super impressive. Arguably got 6 had he would have got past that fight with Leon Edwards. Absolutely dominating in his prime as well. When Usman was in his prime, it was just different, man. It was different watching Usman in his prime because he was so dominant. And what was making him scary as well, how he was getting better in every fight. I remember at the beginning of his title run, he was kind of just seen as this wrestler who would hold people against the cage like he did in that fight with Masvidal. But as his career progressed, he started developing power. He started developing knockout ability. He started developing striking. And it was scary to see because it genuinely looked like no welterweight was going to come close to beating this guy. The next reason, 2nd most consecutive wins in UFC history. I mean, he would have if he had beaten Leon Edwards, he'd have been tied first with the most consecutive wins in UFC history. But having 15 wins in a row in the UFC, super impressive for Kamaru Usman, just behind one of the GOATs himself, Anderson Silva, which is incredibly impressive record to have. And the last reason is he dominated Leon in the second fight before the knockout. I get it. I'm not trying to take away from the knockout. I'm not going to sit here and say that it was a fluke knockout. But had he lasted 1 more minute, he would have beaten Leon Edwards. Leon Edwards wouldn't have had a title run. You know, Usman could have still been a champion to this day for all we know. He would have beaten Leon, got that extra defense on his name, had the tied most consecutive wins in UFC history, been higher up on this list, and he dominated Leon, which showed he still had the ability. So I'm going to put Usman at number 14th. I think he's one of the most accomplished. Leon fucked this guy's career up because had he just lasted 1 more minute against Leon, he could have potentially been in the top 10. And who knows what his career would have looked like nowadays. But he's still one of the greatest regardless. I think he's the 2nd greatest welterweight of all time. I'm going to put it at number 14th. For number 13th, I'm going to go with Max Holloway, who recently competed this weekend. I mean, Max Holloway, how can you not include him in a top 15 GOAT list? The number 1 reason is he's got 3 featherweight title defenses. I mean, that's not the number 1 reason in terms of the most important, but it's something you can have. 3 featherweight title defenses, 2 against Jose Aldo, who some would regard as the greatest, and obviously 1 over Brian Ortega as well. Former champion with 3 defenses is super impressive for Max Holloway, and he already proved that he was champion material, and also over Frankie Edgar as well. Beating Frankie Edgar, one of the greatest as well. So the fact that he had those 3 featherweight title defenses was super impressive. The next reason is, apart from Volk and Ilia, he dominated his era of featherweight, beating everyone. If you take away Alexander Volkanovski and Ilia Toria, Max Holloway just dominated. I mean, look at the amount of people he's beaten. This is Max Holloway's record if you just simply eliminate Ilia Toria and Alexander Volkanovski from 2014 onwards. He just smokes everyone. That's not even including his lightweight win over Justin Gaethje as well. This is just simply including his run that he went on in the featherweight division. So it's no surprise that people still, despite maybe not beating Volkanovski and beating obviously Ilia, this is why people still consider him the top 2 or at least top 3 greatest of all time in the featherweight division. Which, I mean, you've got to include him in the top 3, but some people even put him above Aldo and Volkanovski. And he was just a monster clearing out the featherweight division. And this is why Volkanovski said to Ilia Toria previous that he didn't want Toria to face Holloway, because he knew that Holloway had a very good chance of beating him because of how Holloway was looking against every other contender. He just beat everyone apart from Volk and Ilia. And the Ilia fight was last week as well. So if I'd have recorded this 2 weeks ago, it would have just been Volk. The next reason is he might have the greatest resume of all time. I know I went on earlier in the video about how Dustin Poirier might have the greatest resume of all time. But what about Max Holloway? Look at the people he's beaten. Jose Aldo on 2 different occasions. Charles Oliveira, Justin Gaethje, Frankie Edgar, Cub Swanson, Yair Rodriguez, Arnold Allen, Keita, Pettis, Jeremy Stevens, Andre Fili. I mean, he's probably the imposter on this list. Korean Zombie. This is his resume. He's got such a good resume. He might have one of the greatest resumes in UFC history. If we're going resume, if we're basing the GOAT list purely off resume, Holloway's got to be top 3 at least. This guy might have one of the greatest resumes of all time. And even some controversial fights that he lost, which I'm going to get into in a second. You could have added to that resume as well. And that brings me on to my last point, which is he pretty much beat Prime Aldo and arguably beat Volk. When he was beating Aldo, Aldo would run this massive winning streak. He lost to McGregor, beat Frankie Edgar, and that was when Holloway beat Aldo back-to-back. So it was pretty... It might have not been the exact Prime Aldo, but it was at least Aldo when he was close to his prime. And it definitely wasn't a washed Jose Aldo when Holloway beat him. And like I said, this was the Aldo that was coming off a win over Frankie Edgar. And then the Volkanovski fight as well, he arguably beat Volk. He arguably beat Alexander Volkanovski in that second fight with Volk. A lot of people seem to think that Holloway won that fight. I understand why it was a very, very close fight. So he arguably has Volk on his resume as well, which just makes him even more great. So I'm going to say that Max Holloway gets that 13th spot in the GOAT list. I think he's one of the greatest of all time. Top 3 greatest featherweights of all time as well, and has one of the greatest resumes of all time. At number 12, I'm going to go with Khabib Nurmagomedov. Now, I feel like Khabib's very odd in a GOAT list. There are some people out there that won't even include Khabib at in the top 15. There are some people that won't include him anything below 5. I'm personally going to put him at number 12. I mean, the first main reason is he had 29-0, an undefeated perfect record. Having a 29-0 record, I mean, it can't get more perfect than that. Never losing a fight, having pretty much nearly 30 wins without losing a single fight. He's super impressive. I think he's got probably the most perfect record in UFC history. 29 wins, 0 losses, never lost a fight. Nobody could ever beat this man. And it just kind of shows you how dominant he was. He never bled, and he arguably never lost a round. Similar to Chael Sonnen, to never bleed in the octagon for having 29 fights in the lightweight division, going against guys like Justin Gaethje and other killers, and never bleeding. Never mind never bleeding, but arguably never even losing a round. Imagine retiring, knowing that some people can say that you've never lost a single round in the UFC. Personally, I don't know if I agree with the fact that he's never lost a round, but the fact that he was so dominant, he never lost a round, he never bled in the octagon, he never shed blood, just shows you how kind of dominant he was. And that brings me to my next point, which is another tied to how dominant he was. The most 10-8 rounds in UFC history. I'm pretty sure Khabib holds the record for the most 10-8 rounds in UFC history, which basically just means he holds the most rounds for basically the most dominating rounds in UFC history goes to Khabib, which has all just been building up to my last point, which is he is one of the, if not the most dominant fighter of all time. I struggle to think of a fighter that has been more dominant than Khabib. Like, everybody knows what Khabib's going to do. He's going to take you down, maul you, and look for the submission if he doesn't beat you with ground and pound. I mean, he said it to everyone before every fight, and no one can seem to stop it. He's doing it to the best. Did it to Gaethje when Gaethje was the interim champ. Did it to Poirier. Did it to McGregor. I think he's the most dominant fighter of all time. I mean, the most 10-8 rounds in UFC history, arguably never losing a round. That kind of speaks for itself. So I think he's the most dominant fighter of all time. So I'm going to put Khabib Nurmagomedov at number 12. I understand he didn't have the longest title run. He didn't get the most defenses, and he didn't have the longest resume. And a lot of his record was padded, which is why I can't really put him above number 12. But 29-0, perfect record, super dominant. I'm going to include Khabib at number 12. And then number 11, I'm going to go for a guy who Khabib gets compared to a lot. Islam Makhachev. I think Islam Makhachev surpassed Khabib. He's got a record of 26-1. I think Islam Makhachev is going to go to number 11. Now, the first reason why, he's the best fighter in the modern era. The modern era of the UFC is seen as the most competitive era. I mean, it is. UFC today is the most competitive era. And for Islam Makhachev to be the best, he's basically the best fighter in the most competitive era of the UFC, and I think that alone just shows how good Islam Makhachev is. He just seems unbeatable. I can't imagine a single fighter in the UFC, whether it be Topuria or Sarugian or Oliveira or whoever, I can't imagine anyone beating Islam Makhachev, even though technically they might be able to. I just can't imagine him for how good he is. The next reason, he's got an insane resume as well. I mean, just look at his resume. Volkanovski twice, Charles Oliveira, Dustin Poirier. That's not even to like count the other guys as well, but beating Alexander Volkanovski by a very close decision in an absolute war, super impressive. And then to go out there and knock him out in the next fight when Volkanovski was pound for pound top 3, I think he was, to submit Charles Oliveira when Charles Oliveira was the defending champion, to submit the submission artist, to go out there and submit Dustin Poirier, who we've already been over, has one of the greatest resumes of all time. And that's not even to mention the win over Arman Tsarukyan, Dan Hooker, Bobby Green, and Drew Dober, who were just another couple of good wins that he had in the lightweight division. He has an insane resume, and that for me is what puts Makhachev above Khabib, because Khabib had a good resume, you know, Gaethje, McGregor, and Poirier, but Makhachev's was on a whole nother level. He has an insane resume. The next reason, he only lost one time. For some reason, people value being undefeated so much in GOAT lists, which is why the Khabib fanboys think he's number 1. But Makhachev only lost one time. It wasn't a fluke. He did lose, but 26-1, pretty much a picture-perfect record, with his only loss going to a knockout loss by Adriano Martins back in the day. But no, yeah, only lost one time by knockout. So I'm going to put Islam Makhachev at number 11. The best fighter in the UFC currently. Again, I'm not going to look at his potential too much, because for all we know, he could be a champion in a different organization. He could go on to get more defenses. But already what he's achieved with his resume, with how dominant he is, with how good he looks, I'm going to put Islam Makhachev at number 11. I think he's number 11 in the GOAT list. At number 10, I'm going to go with Alex Pereira, the current light heavyweight champion of the world. I think Poaton's got to be in the top 10. I mean, he's always been a discussion of, is Poaton the GOAT? Is he going to get close to the GOAT list? I think we've got to include him in the top 10. It's about that time we've got to at least include him in the top 10. The number 1 reason, he is the most accomplished MMA fighter in the shortest amount of time. I believe that Alex Pereira He's the most accomplished fighter in the shortest amount of time. I mean, he debuted in 2021, and we're now in 2024. The amount of people he's beaten since then, he's been insane. The amount of former champions he's beaten since then. I mean, Sean Strickland, Adesanya, Jan Blachowicz, Jamal Hill, Yuri twice, Khalil Roundtree in the space of 3 years since his UFC debut. I think we've got to give him credit. And that's not even to mention the fact that he's won 2 belts in 2 different weight... Well, 1 belt in 2 different weight classes. He's the most accomplished MMA fighter in the shortest amount of time. I truly believe it. The next reason is he's beaten 5 former champions in 3 years at the UFC. This kind of ties back to my last point, but 5 former champions. He beat Sean Strickland, former champion, Adesanya, Jan Blachowicz, Jamal Hill, Yuri twice. He beat all those guys in the space of 3 years. So what Porton's done already in such a short amount of time, you've got to give him credit for as well. You've got to give him the respect for that as well. I mean, so many former champions he beat in 3 years. Has any other UFC fighter beaten that many former champions in a short amount of time? I don't think they have. I'm pretty sure Porton holds the record for that anyway. The next reason, first guy to beat Adesanya in the middleweight division. I remember there was a time when Adesanya was just looking unstoppable in the middleweight division. You know, he was on this insane tear. He lost at the light heavyweight division to Jan Blachowicz by decision, but apart from that, nobody at middleweight could really beat him. Alex Pereira, the first guy to beat him, and he was an underdog going into that fight as well. Adesanya was a favorite, and he goes out there and he's the first guy to beat Israel Adesanya in middleweight history. In MMA as a whole, not even just in the UFC, but in MMA as a whole, he was the first guy to beat Adesanya. So that's another accomplishment he has. And the next reason, he held the belt in 2 weight classes, middleweight and light heavyweight. First guy to hold the belt in both the middleweight and the light heavyweight division. Is super impressive for Porton. Middleweight champion, light heavyweight champion. I mean, that just adds to the already stacked resume and the already stacked career that he has. So Alex Pereira, I'm going to put at number 10. Again, we don't know what the future holds. He could even be a 3-divisional champion. For all we know, he could be the first 3-divisional champion in the UFC. Record of 12-2. When you look at a guy with a record of 12-2, you usually assume that they're fairly new to the UFC. They're probably a contender series fighter. They've had a couple of wins. Porton's already top 10 greatest of all time and one of the most accomplished, despite having, the short career. I mean, we talked about Topuria earlier on in the video, having been only 16-0 and accomplished what he's accomplished. But Porton's 12-2. He's had 14 fights, and he's one of the most accomplished in the UFC. He's going to number 10. And number 9, I'm going to go with DC. You've got to include DC in the GOAT list. The first reason, I mean, 4 title defenses, 1 in the heavyweight division, 3 in light heavyweight. I mean, come on for DC, man. Beating Alexander Gustafsson, beating, all these guys needed in the heavyweight division, holding 2 belts at the same time as well, just adds to the resume. Double champ as well, like I just went over, heavyweight and light heavyweight. I mean, again, just similar to Cejudo and Conor McGregor, a guy that was able to hold 2 belts simultaneously, the king of 2 divisions simultaneously. There's only been a few fighters that have been able to do that at the same time. And even most of the guys that I've got in this image haven't done that at the same time. DC was one of them who did it at the same time. So the fact that he was double champ just adds to his resume. He only lost to Stipe and Jones as well, and he has 1 win over Stipe. His only losses in MMA is to arguably the greatest of all time, and Stipe Miocic. Stipe, he has a win over anyway, in one of the Jones fights and then a no contest. So really, he's only lost a fight to Jones. Apart from that, he's been able to beat everyone. He's been able to dominate the rest of the light heavyweight division. And like I said, 2-1 against Stipe. Lost to Jones once, but Jones is the greatest of all time. So those are the only guys he lost to. And he was mauling everyone whilst being undersized. DC was tiny. He's 5'8". You compare that to the likes of, the guys who was fighting at heavyweight, like Derek Lewis and Stipe. He was undersized in the heavyweight division, yet still mauling everyone. He's just about small. He's spot on Sean O'Malley as well. But yeah, DC, I'm going to put him at number 9. I think you've got to put DC on the GOAT list somewhere at number 9. And then number 8, I'm going to go with Fedor Emelianenko. In my opinion, the 2nd greatest heavyweight of all time. I hate it when people completely downplay the career of Fedor. When people look at him and they kind of downplay him. They call him a can crusher. They say that he never accomplished anything crazy because he never fought in the UFC. You don't understand the run that Fedor Emelianenko went on. I mean, the number 1 reason, he was basically undefeated from 2000 to 2009. From those years, look at the amount of fights he had that he was practically unbeaten in. Every single one of these fights, he never lost a fight. I mean, every single one of these fights, he just won an insane tear from 2000 to 2009. 9 years straight of just non-stop winning fights, and most of them coming by way of finish, never losing as well, which just shows you how dominant Fedor Emelianenko was in his prime and why he deserves to be called one of the greatest heavyweights. The next reason, 18 consecutive lineal title defenses. Now, this isn't UFC, but just to say that he had 18 defenses as well. I mean, we talk about Jones being the GOAT for 13 and Demetrius Johnson with, I think it was 11. For Fedor Emelianenko having 18 consecutive lineal title defenses just shows you how dominant he was in his prime, how hard it was for people to get past Fedor Emelianenko, how many levels above he was compared to everyone else in the heavyweight division at the time. The next reason, He has wins over 6 former/future UFC champions. There's this big criticism that Fedor Emelianenko gets that he can never be considered the GOAT or one of the GOATs because he never beat UFC talent. He has wins over 6 former/future at the time UFC champions. I mean, just look at what he was doing to the likes of Andrei Arlovski, who, you know, obviously a former UFC champion. He put his lats out brutally. Fedor Emelianenko's faced guys who have been UFC champions, and he has wins over 6 of them. So you can't really just criticize him for not being in the UFC. The next reason is he literally demolished every heavyweight in his era, including a bunch of juice heads. This is what Fedor Emelianenko was doing. He was dominating everyone in his era. He was basically fighting a bunch of guys that were on juice. Fedor Emelianenko just went out there, dominated everyone in his era, and that's why you can't really criticize him. People said that he never was able to beat the likes of Stipe or beat a guy like Ngannou or beat one of the more modern heavyweights. In his era of the heavyweight division, he was the best. In the heavyweight division in Fedor Emelianenko's era, he was the best. Same way that Makhachev is the best in his era in the lightweight division. Same way that Poatan is the best in his era of the light heavyweight division. Fedor was the best in his era of the heavyweight division. So you can't discredit him for that. And you can't just say because he was never a UFC champion, he can't be on the GOAT list. He was just battering everyone, showing how many levels he was above against everyone else. And for that reason, you've got to give Fedor credit. So I'm going to put Fedor at number 8. Some people would put him against Stipe. I mean, a record of 40-7 just shows you what he was doing in different divisions. In the divisions in like Bellator, but not even just Bellator, but his main career in Pride. And all these other divisions, all these other companies as well. Fedor Emelianenko was an absolute beast. Some people put him above Stipe. I don't have a problem with that. 40-7, absolute monster. But I'm going to put Stipe above Fedor Emelianenko. I think Stipe is the greatest heavyweight of all time, and I'm going to say he's the 7th greatest fighter of all time. Yeah, Stipe, I mean, number 1 reason, 4 title defenses at heavyweight, and 4 title defenses at heavyweight is very impressive, by the way. Like, if you think about this being the heavyweight division where most people can't even defend once, Stipe defended it not once, not twice, not 3 times, but 4 different times in the heavyweight division. Stipe Miocic defended his belt in a division like heavyweight when everyone was getting knocked out. I mean, I remember when Stipe defended his belt. I think it was against Overeem or Junior Dos Santos, and people were shocked because they're like, "Oh my gosh, we finally got a heavyweight that has defended his belt." For him to do that 4 times in this division is super impressive. The next reason is beating the best heavyweights in his era. Yeah, Stipe did just that, beating the best heavyweights in his era. I mean, Junior Dos Santos, like I went, an absolute monster. Stipe beat him. DC was 2-1 against DC when DC was on the come up as well. Just everyone that Stipe was getting put against, he was beating them all. He was the best heavyweight in his era, and he was beating the best heavyweights in his era at the same time, which is why I think he's the greatest heavyweight of all time. The next reason is he has some really good ones, and he beating DC twice in Ngannou, in my opinion, is his most impressive win. DC is one of the greatest of all time. For Stipe to be able to beat that dude twice, that's super impressive, because outside of Stipe, the only other guy that's been able to beat DC is Jones. Apart from that, DC dominated everyone. So for Stipe to beat him twice and beat Francis Ngannou, and obviously got brutally KO'd by Ngannou, but the fact that he actually has a win over Ngannou as well in the UFC in pretty dominant fashion as well, you've got to give even more credit to Stipe. So he has some really good wins there. So I'm going to put Stipe at number 7, the greatest heavyweight of all time. He beat the best he had in the UFC. He was in the Premier Division, 4 title defenses, beat basically the best at the time. And who knows? It's unlikely, but for all we know, he could go out there and absolutely demolish John Jones at UFC 309 and become a not a 2-time, but once again, a heavyweight champion, a 3-time heavyweight champion in the UFC. So I'm going to put Stipe at number 7. At number 6, I'm going to go with Alexander Volkanovski. Alexander the Great Volkanovski is going to go at number 6 for me. You can't have a GOAT list without Volkanovski. I mean, he's got to be in the top 5, top 6, that area. The first reason why, 5 title defenses in the modern era is super impressive. I mean, nowadays, if people get more than 3 defenses, people are already sticking him in the GOAT list. For Volk to get 5, super impressive. I mean, like I said, nowadays, people ain't getting defenses. Sean O'Malley, he could barely going to get a defenses. Now, Volkanovski's gone out there and got 5 straight defenses. Holloway was a defense. Ortega was a defense. Korean Zombie. Holloway again, the third one being the most decisive. Yair Rodriguez, 5 defenses in the featherweight division. Beat Holloway 3 times in Aldo. I'm just going over his most impressive wins. I mean, most people would consider Max Holloway one of the GOATs. If you weren't including Holloway in your top 15 GOAT list, what are you doing? Max Volkanovski beat this dude not once, not twice, but 3 different times, with the third one being the most decisive. To beat Holloway 3 times is pretty much unheard of. And he beat Jose Aldo as well, which is just another impressive win. He's basically beaten the other greatest featherweights of all time. But if you ask most people to do a top 3 greatest featherweight of all time list, they'll do Volk, Aldo, and Holloway. Volk's the only guy to have a win over both of those guys, and one of them 3 times as well. Next reason, he dominated his era of the featherweight division. When Volkanovski was in his prime, he was just so dominant. I remember watching him when he was facing the likes of Holloway and just facing like the likes of Korean Zombie. He was so dominant. It looked like nobody was going to take that belt away from Volkanovski. Obviously, Topuria eventually went up and did it, but he was just so dominant. Nobody could really nobody could hurt Volkanovski. It wasn't even like he got in trouble. The only real trouble Volkanovski ever went in was when he got in that guillotine of Brian Ortega. Apart from that, he was just so many levels above every heavyweight on the planet. He was making Holloway look like an amateur, and Holloway, as we know, was one of the greatest heavyweight featherweights of all time. So he dominated his era, and he arguably beat Islam and should have been double champ. I mean, just to add to his already stacked resume, obviously he fought Islam Makhachev for double champ status. He nearly finished him in that 5th round, and when it came to the decision, a lot of people thought that Volkanovski should have been able to beat Islam Makhachev. There's a big conversation over, was that fight a robbery? So the fact that he arguably could have beaten Islam Makhachev, who was the lightweight champion, who's pound for pound #1, had a super impressive win and could have been double champion, and was literally just a judge away from doing that, just shows you how great Volkanovski really was. So I'm going to put Volkanovski at number 6. 26-4, dominated the featherweight division, arguably beat Makhachev, and he's one of the most skilled fighters, one of the most well-rounded fighters we've ever seen in the UFC. I'm putting him at number 6. And number 5, I'm going to go with Anderson Silva. I just skipped by. The first reason why I'm going to go with Anderson Silva, I mean, 10 title defenses. I mean, I've been glazing these guys for getting 4 or 5 defenses, and then here comes Anderson Silva with 10 title defenses. I get it he was on juice, but 10 straight title defenses in the UFC from 2006 to 2012 is so impressive for Anderson Silva. He just dominated the middleweight division, beating the likes of Dan Henderson, beating the likes of Forrest Griffin, beating the likes of Vitor Belfort. Everyone that he came in contact with, he was just defending his belt against. The next reason, he was levels above literally everyone at middleweight at the time. The best way to describe Anderson Silva is that he was just levels above everyone. You know, you've got guys who are on the lower level of the middleweight division, guys who are slightly above them, their level, you know, guys who are close to the title picture, and then you've got Silva, who is just absolute levels above everybody in the middleweight division at the time. Not even close, not even comparable to the skill level. He was just so much better than everyone, and he just toyed with everyone in the octagon. Everyone was trying the hardest to even just land on Anderson Silva, and Silva, he just made it look like a complete game. He was just mocking everyone. Obviously, that would end up being his downfall when he started mocking Chris Weidman and he got knocked out. But the fact that he was just toyed with everyone, and it looked like he just knocked people out whenever he wanted to, it just showed you how many levels, how many levels above he was compared to everyone else. The next reason, he owned the UFC from 2006 to 2012. There was no one that you could even compare, and I'm going back to his record, that you could even compare to Anderson Silva from 2006 to 2012. He was just so far ahead of everyone. It was like, I mean, going back to the point, he just owned the UFC. If it wasn't for Silva in the UFC, I mean, Silva made the UFC. He was the original GOAT of the UFC. When Silva was in his prime, people were already saying that he was never going to be overtaken as the GOAT because of how dominant he looked at the time. He was just so many levels above everyone else. And he has the record for the longest consecutive win streak in UFC history. I mean, having that as well, just, I mean, it adds to his already stacked career. 16 straight wins in the UFC and no losses. I mean, 16 straight wins in the UFC alone is crazy. It showed that he didn't really have a padded record. I mean, we talk about guys like Khabib having a padded record. I mean, Silva just won 16 straight wins in the UFC. Man, so yeah, Silva, massive winning streak. I think he's the top five of all time. And even though he did take steroids and he wanted a bit of a losing streak towards the end of his career, prime Silva, I mean, he was one of the most dominant fighters of all time. And number 4, I'm going to go with Jose Aldo. In my opinion, Aldo is the greatest featherweight of all time. I know it's between him and Volkanovski, and it's honestly give or take. It don't really matter who you pick. But I think it's Jose Aldo. The first reason, 7 UFC title defenses. And I say UFC in brackets because that's not even counting WEC. 7 title defenses in the UFC against high-quality opponents as well. It ain't against bums. This is against high-quality opponents that Jose Aldo's defending the belt against. And that's, like I said, that's not even counting WEC, the extra wins that he had down there, which was basically the UFC for smaller guys. The fact that he defended his belt on so many different occasions, the most featherweight title defenses, the fact that he holds that record, and you've just got to give him his credit for how dominant he was. The next point is he ran the featherweight division for 6 years and he beat everyone. You know, Frankie Edgar, he was beaten. Chad Mendes, he was beaten. Korean Zombie, he was beaten. Farai Faber, he was beaten. These were the top guys at the time, and He was just beating everyone. He was just running the featherweight division for the time. For 6 years straight, there was nobody that could even come close to beating Jose Aldo in the featherweight division. He's still beating ranked nowadays, bantamweights nowadays. I mean, even nowadays, how old is he now? Late 30s. He's still beating. I mean, you look at his last 5. Let's just run through his last 5. He had a robbery loss over Mario Batista. He beat number 13th Jonathan Martinez. He lost to Merab, who's now the champ. He beat number 9 Rob Font. He beat Pedro Munoz when Pedro Munoz was number 9. And he beat Marlon Oliveira, the current number 6 ranked. So he's still winning to nowadays, which just kind of just shows you the long longevity of Jose Aldo. So I'm going to go with Jose Aldo at number 4. In his prime, he looked pretty much unstoppable. I think he's the greatest featherweight of all time. And it's not even just what he did at featherweight. It's also the work that he's done in the bantamweight division. The fact that he is still successful to this day, and the fact that he is still ranked in the bantamweight division to this day, and most would consider him a top 10 bantamweight, just shows you how good Aldo is and how much longevity he's had. So I'm going to put him at number 4. And number 3, I'm going to go with Demetrius Johnson. Some people put him at number 1. I'm going to go with Demetrius Johnson at number 3. I mean, Demetrius Johnson was just ridiculously skilled for the UFC. I still can't believe the UFC traded him for Ben Askren. I know they made a star out of Jorge Masvidal, but the fact that you could even think about, you know, trading Demetrius Johnson for Ben Askren is crazy. The first reason, 11 title defenses. I mean, that's fucking crazy, man. Having 11 title defenses in the flyweight division. I mean, I remember when the UFC were considering just completely, you know, just getting rid of the flyweight division, completely just sacking it because of how dominant he was and the fact that nobody, no matter who they put him against, could beat Demetrius Johnson. They were literally considering getting rid of this division because of how dominant he was. I mean, 11 title defenses it just shows you how dominant he was. I think he's the most skilled fighter of all time. I think if we were to do a pound-for-pound list of all time, I'd probably put Demetrius Johnson at number 1. I think he's the most skilled fighter of all time, the most well-rounded fighter of all time. Amazing wrestling, amazing jiu-jitsu, amazing. It's like if you were to build a perfect fighter in like a video game, Demetrius Johnson would be the outcome. He is the most skilled fighter of all time, in my opinion. He cleared out the flyweight division as well. Like I said before, the UFC literally had to consider getting rid of the flyweight division because of how dominant Demetrius Johnson was in that division, facing the best in the competition at the time and doing well in that as well. So clearing out the flyweight division. I'm going to put Demetrius Johnson at number 3. More skilled fighter of all time. And you know what? It begs the question. What would have Demetrius Johnson accomplished had the UFC never traded him? Because if Demetrius Johnson stayed in the UFC, he could still be flyweight champion to this day. You're saying Demetrius Johnson can't beat Brandon Moreno or Davison Figueiredo or even the likes of, I mean, Pantoja. These are the guys that Demetrius Johnson could easily beat. So I'm going to say that Demetrius Johnson, I think he's the 3rd greatest of all time in the entirety of the UFC. Definitely the greatest flyweight. At number 2, I'm going to go with GSP. 26-2 as a record just shows the dominance that this dude had. 9 title defenses GSP had. I mean, 9 title defenses in the welterweight division. And this was when he was going against the likes of BJ Penn and Carlos Condit, Johnny Hendricks, Matt Hughes as well, Matt Serra, these guys that had already beaten him in the past as well. These were the guys that he was defending his belt against. He weren't defending his belt against Cans. There's no argument to make that Demetrius Johnson's title defenses weren't as impressive because he was beating the flyweights who weren't as impressive. GSP, you don't have that excuse. He was beating the best in the world. The next reason, took 4 years off, came back and casually just became the middleweight champion. He got bored after retirement, came back and casually just beat Bisping to become the middleweight champion. Went against Bisping, choked him out, casually put Bisping to sleep to just casually win a belt in a different weight class. And that's another thing on his resume. He's held 2 different held 2 different belts in 2 different weight classes. The next reason is he's beat everyone he's lost to. The 2 guys that he's lost to in Matt Serra, I mean, he lost to Matt Serra, beat Matt Serra, lost to Matt Hughes, beat Matt Hughes. So there has never been a guy that has beaten GSP and then gone into retire into the sunset without also losing to GSP. He's basically beaten every single fighter that he's ever gone against. And the number 1, I'm going to go with Jon Jones. I think you've just got to put Jon Jones. I know he takes steroids. I know he's not a likable guy. I know he's not a good representative of the sport outside the octagon, but he is the greatest of all time. I mean, 13 title defenses in the UFC. I mean, we talked about how impressive it was for Fedor Emelianenko to have, what was it, 18 consecutive lineal title defenses. But you can make an argument that that wasn't the elite competition because it wasn't in the UFC. Jon Jones having 13 title defenses in the UFC, 13 title defenses from 2011 all the way from 2020, 9 years of just straight defending the same belt against completely different opposition. Most title wins in UFC history as well. He holds that record. I think the title defenses alone is why most people consider him the GOAT. Also, the fact that he never lost a fight as well. I mean, everyone likes to, especially the Khabib fans, love to go on the fact that he, never losing a fight makes you one of the greatest of all time. Well, no one has been able to beat Jon Jones in the octagon. He's 27-1, and that one loss is an elbow disqualification, which is now coming this weekend. Going to be a rule that is going to be rid from the UFC. So technically, on paper, I understand at the time it was a rule, but he's never lost a fight. I mean, I know he had a very close fight with Dominick Cruz, but he's never really lost a fight. Next reason, champion in I just find this crazy that he was a champion in 2011 and a champion in 2024. The fact that back in 2011, Jon Jones was a UFC champion, and the fact that still nowadays in 2024, 13 years later, he's still a UFC champion, still competing, still headlining pay-per-views. I found that crazy because it's kind of mad when we have a champion that was a champion back in like 2019 or 2018 that still happens to be fighting for belts in 2024. But the fact that this dude was a champion in 2011 and he's still a champion nowadays, I'm not saying he was a champion non-stop, but I just find that crazy. And he beat 3 generations of fighters. That's what impressed me about Jon Jones. He beat the pre-Jones era when he was facing the likes of Rampage and Shogun. He beat his era when he was facing the likes of Gustafsson and DC. And he's beaten the future era, the post-Jones era, when he's beating the new generation like Cyril Gane. He's beaten 3 different generations of fighters and champions, which I think is the definition of being the greatest of not just one time, but the greatest of all time. You can make arguments that BJ Penn and Anderson Silva, these guys went on losing streaks towards the end of their career. They weren't the greatest of all time, whereas Jones, he is literally the greatest of all time because he beat every single generation. And the last reason is he has a belt in 2 different weight classes, not simultaneously, but the fact that he was the light heavyweight champion and he's the heavyweight champion, and that was just the extra cherry on top of his career. I think there's no doubt that Jon Jones is the greatest fighter of all time, and most people would agree. I know he took steroids, but what this dude has accomplished, I think he is the most accomplished fighter of all time. But that is my top 30 GOAT list. But before we go off, we're going to go over some honorable mentions with I think you could have also included in this list that I'm just going to include anyway. I think Robert Whittaker. I think you've got to include Robert Whittaker, a guy with another really good resume, a former champion. Aljamain Sterling, great bantamweight. You could include him as well because of the, I guess the title run that he went on, even though it was kind of fraudulent. Dan Henderson, Tyron Woodley, Mirko Cro Cop. These are just some extra names. And I'm not going to put in my top 30, but I wouldn't be mad if you put him in like a top 35, or I wouldn't complain if somebody put them in their top 30. But that is my top 30 greatest MMA fighters of all time. Let me know your thoughts on this list. Is it a good list? Is it a bad list? And if you agree or disagree with the placements, because I'm pretty sure MMA GOAT lists are some of the most controversial things you can do in MMA YouTube. So let me know your thoughts on this list. Thank you for watching.